father doing videos. Today, we have a HP LoveCraft Mythos read, The Call of Cthulhu. This is going to be the first read out of this book. I hope y'all enjoy it. The Call of Cthulhu, found among the papers of the late Francis Wayland Thurston of Boston. Of such great powers or beings, there may be conceivably a survival of a hugely remote period when consciousness was manifested, perhaps in shapes and forms long since withdrawn before the tide of advancing humanity, forms of which poetry and legend alone have caught a flying memory and called them gods, monsters, mythological beings of all sorts and kinds. Algernon Blackwood. The tale of Inspector LeGrasse, here on page 23. The older matters, which had made the sculptor's dream and Bashford Lee so significant to my uncle, formed the subject of the second half of his long manuscript. Once before, it appears, Professor Angell had seen the hellish outlines of the nameless monstrosity, puzzled over the unknown hieroglyphics, and heard the anonymous syllables, which can be rendered only as Cthulhu. And all this in a stern and horrible a connection that is small wonder he pursed young Wilcox with queries and demands for data. The early experience had come in 1908, 17 years before, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis. Professor Angell, as befitted one of his authority and attainments, had had a prominent part in all the deliberations, and was one of the first to be approached by the several outsiders who took advantage of the convocation to offer questions for correct answers and problems for expert solution. The chief of these outsiders, and in a short time the focus of interest for the entire meeting, was a commonplace-looking middle-aged man who had traveled all the way from New Orleans for certain special information unobtainable from any local source. His name was John Raymond LeGrasse, and he was by profession an inspector of police. With him, he bore the subject of his visit, a grotesque, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette whose origin he was at loss to determine. It must not be fancied that Inspector LeGrasse had the least interest in archaeology. On the contrary, his wish for enlightenment was prompted by purely professional considerations. The statuette, idol, fetish, or whatever it was, had been captured some months before in the wooded swamps of New Orleans during a raid on a supposed voodoo meeting, and so singular and hideous were the rites connected with it that the police could not but realize that they had stumbled on a dark coat, totally unknown to them, and infinitely more diabolic than even the blackest of the African voodoo circles. Of its origin, apart from the erratic and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, absolutely nothing was to be discovered. Hence, the anxiety of the police for an antiquarian lore, which might help them to place the frightful symbol, and through it track down the coat to its fountainhead. Inspector LeGrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offerings created. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of the science into the state of tense excitement, and they lost no time in crowding around him to gaze at the diminutive figure, whose utter strangeness and air of genuinely abyssal antiquity hindered to potently at open and archaic vistas. No recognized school of sculpture had animated the terrible object. Yet, centuries and even thousands of years seem recorded its dim and greenish surface of unplaceable stone. The figure, which was finally passed slowly from man to man for close and careful study, was between 7 and 8 inches in height, and of exquisitely artistic workmanship. It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with the octopus-like head, whose face was a mass of fillers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. This thing was seen instinct with the fearsome and unnatural malignancy, was of somewhat bloated corpulence, and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with undesirable characters. The tips of the wings touched the back edge of the block. The seat occupied the center. Whistle, the long, curved claws of the doubled up, crouching hind legs gripped the front edge and extended a quarter of the way down toward the bottom of the pedestal. The cephalopod head was bent forward, so that the ends of the facial fillers brushed the backs of the huge forepaws which clasped the croucher's elevated knees. The aspect of the whole was abnormally lifelike, and the more subtly fearful because its source was so totally unknown. Its vast, awesome, and incalculable age was unmistakable. Yet, not one link did it show with any type of the belonging to civilization's youth, or indeed to any other time. Totally separate and apart, its very material was a mystery, for the soapy, greenish black stone with its golden or iridescent flecks and striations resembled nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. The characters along the base were equally baffling, and no member present, despite a representation of half the world's experts learning in the field, could form the least notion of even the remotest linguistic kinship. They, like the subject and material, belong to something horribly remote and distinct from mankind as we know it, something frightfully suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life in which our world and our conceptions have no part. And yet, as the members severally shook their heads and confessed defeat at the inspector's problem, there was one man in the gathering who suspected a touch of bizarre familiarity in the monstrous shape and writing, and who presently told with some diffidence of the old trifle he knew. This person was the late William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology in Princeton University, and an explorer of no slight note. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth, and with high up on the West Greenland coast had encountered a singular tribe or cult of degenerate Eskimos whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith of which other Eskimos knew little, and which they mentioned only with the shudders, saying that it had come down from the horribly ancient eons before ever the world was made. Besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, there were certain queer hereditary rituals addressed to the supreme elder devil or Tornasuk. And of this, Professor Webb had taken a careful phonetic copy from an aged Angikok or wizard priest, expressing the sounds in Roman letters as best he knew how. But just now of prime significance was the fetish which this cult had cherished, and ground which they danced when the aurora leaped high over the ice cliffs. It was, the professor stated, a very crude bas-relief of stone, compromising a hideous picture and some cryptic writing. And so far as he could tell, it was as rough parallel in all essential features of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. This data, received with suspense and astonishment by the assembled members, proved doubly exciting to Inspector Legacy, and he began at once to ply his informant with questions. Having noted and copied an oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers his men had arrested, he besought the professor to remember as best he might the syllables taken down amongst the diabolic Eskimos. There then followed an exhaustive comparison of details, and a moment of really awed silence when both detective and scientists agreed on the virtual identity, the phrase common to two hellish rituals so many worlds of distance apart. What is substance, both the Eskimo wizards and the Louisiana swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something very like this. The word, divisions, being guessed at from traditional breaks in the phrase as chanted aloud. Fanuglui, maglu naf, kotulu rele, waganalavu, fagatin. Legacy had one point in advance of Professor Webb, for several among his mongrel prisoners had repeated to him what older celebrants had told the word meant. This text, as given, ran something like this. In his house at Raleigh, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. And now, in response to the general and urgent demand, Inspector Legacy related as fully as possible his experience with the swamp worshippers, telling a story to which I could see my uncle attach profound significance. It savored of the wildest dreams of myth-maker and theosophist, and disclosed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination among such half-caste and pariahs as might be least expected to possess it. On November 1st, 1907, there had come to the New Orleans police a frantic summons from the swamp and lagoon country to the south. The squatters there, most primitive but good-natured descendants of Lafitte's men, were in the grip of stark terror from the unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. It was voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible sort than they had ever known. And some of their women and children had disappeared since the malevolent tom-tom had begun its incessant beating far within the black haunted woods where no dweller ventured. There were insane shouts and harrowing screams, soul-chilling chants and dancing devil flames, and the frightened messenger added, the people could stand it no more. So a body of 20 police, filling 2 carriages in an automobile, had set out in the late afternoon with the shivering squatter as a guide. At the end of the passable road, they alighted, and for miles splashed in the silence through the terrible cypress woods where day never came. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then a pile of dank stones or fragment of a rotting wall intensified by a hint of morbid inhabitation depression which every malformed tree and every fungus isolate combined to create. At length, the squatter settlement, a miserable huddle of huts, hove in sight, and hysterical dwellers ran out to the cluster around a group of bobbing lanterns. The muffled beat of the tom-toms were now faintly audible far ahead, and a curdling streak came at infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond endless avenues of forest night. Reluctant even to be left alone again, each one of the crowded squatters refused point blank to advance another inch towards the scene of unholy worship. So Inspector Legacy and his 19 colleagues plunged on unguided into the black arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before. The region now entered by the police was one of the traditionally evil repute, substantially unknown and untraversed by white men. There were legends of a hidden lake unglimpsed by mortal sight, in which dwelt a huge formless white polypus thing with luminous eyes. And squatters whispered the bat-winged devils flew up out of the caverns and inner earth to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before d'Iberville, before La Salle, before the Indians, and before even the wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. It was a nightmare itself, and to see it was to die. But it was made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orgy was, indeed, one of the merest fringe of the abhorred area, but the location was bad enough. Hence, perhaps, the very place of the worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legacy's men as they plowed on through the black morass toward the red glare and the muffled tom-toms. There are vocal qualities peculiar to men and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts, and it is terrible to hear the one when the sources should yield the other. Animal fury and orgiastic license here whip themselves to demoniac heights by howls and squawking ecstasies that tore and reverberated through those nighted woods like pestilential tempters from the ghosts of hell. Now and then, the less organized ululation would cease, and from what seemed a well-drilled chorus of hoarse voices would rise and sing-song chant the hideous phrase or ritual, Funogluli maglanaf kotulhu rale wagalanagafa fatij. Then the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in sight of the spectacle itself. 4 of them reeled or fainted, and 2 were shaken into a frantic cry, which the mad cacophony of the orgy fortunately deadened. Legacy dashed swamp water on their face of the fainting man, and all stood trembling and nearly hypnotized with horror. In the natural glade of the swamp stood a grassy island of perhaps an acre's extent, clear of trees and tolerably dry. On this now leaped and twisted a more indescribable horde of human abnormality than any but a sign or an growler could paint. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by occasional rifts in the certain of flame, stood a great granite monolith, some 8 feet in height, on top of which, incongruous with its diminutiveness, rested the nauseous carved statuette from a wide circle of 10 scaffolds set up at regular intervals, which the flame-girt monolith as the center hung. Head downward, the oddly marred bodies of the helpless squatters who had disappeared. It was inside the circle that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared, the general direction of the mass motion being from left to right, an endless bacchanal between the ring of bodies and the ring of fire. It may have been only imagination, and it may have been only echoes which induced one of them, men, an acceptable Spaniard, to fancy he heard antiphonal response to the ritual from some far and unilluminated spot deeper within. Deeper within the wood of ancient, legendary, and horror. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned, and he proved distinctly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hint of the faint beating of great wings, and of a glimpse of a shining eyes and a mountainous white bulk beyond the remotest trees. But I suppose he had been hearing too much native superstition. Actually, the horrified pause of the men was comparatively brief duration. Duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 mongrel celebrants enthroned, the police relied on their firearms and plunged determinedly into the nauseous rout. For 5 minutes, the redolent din and the chaos were beyond description. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired, and escapes were made, but in the end, Lagasse was able to count some 47 sullen prisoners, whom he forced to dress in haste and to fall into line between 2 rows of policemen. 5 of the worshippers lay dead, and 2 severely wounded. 1 were carried away in the prison stretchers by their fellow prisoners. The image of the monolith, of course, was carefully removed and carried back to by Lagasse, examined at the headquarters after a trip intense strain and weariness. The prisoners all proved to be men of very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant type. Most were seamen, and a sprinkling of Negroes and mulattoes, largely West Indians or Brava Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands, gave a coloring of voodooism to the heterogeneous coat. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older than Negro fetishism was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their loathsome faith. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before they were any men and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told their secrets and dreams to the first man, who formed a cult which had never died. This was the cult, and the person said it had always existed and always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world, until the time when the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of R'lyeh under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Someday he would call, when the stars were ready, and the secret cult could always be waiting to liberate him. Meanwhile, no more must be told. There was a secret which even torture could not extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the conscious things of earth, for shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful few. But these were not the great old ones. No man had ever seen the old ones. The carven idol was great Cthulhu, but none might say whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writings now, but things were told by word of mouth. The chanted ritual was not the secret. That was never spoken aloud, only whispered. The chant meant only this: in his house at Raleigh, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged, and the rest were committed to various institutions. All denied a part in the ritual murders and averred that the killings had been done by black winged ones, which had come to them from their immemorial meeting place in the haunted wood. But of the mysterious allies, no coherent account could ever be gained. What the police did extract came mainly from the immensely aged mestizo named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that paled that speculations of theosophists and made men and the world seem recent and transient. Indeed, there had been eons when other things ruled on the earth, and they had great cities. Remains of them, he had said, the deathless Chinamen had told him, were still to be found as cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs. Stars had come round again, the right positions in the cycle of eternity. They had indeed come themselves from the stars and brought their images with them. These great old ones, Castro continued, were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had shape, for did not this star-fashioned image prove it? But that shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky. But when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer live, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of Raleigh, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu for a glorious resurrection, when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at that time, some force from outside must have served to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserved them intact likewise prevented them from uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, but their mode of speech was transmitted thought. Even now they talked ones, spoke to sensitive among them by molding their dreams, for only thus could their language reach the fleshly minds of mammals. Then whispered Castro, those first men formed the code around small idols, which the great ones shewed them, idols brought in dim errors from dark stars. The cult would never die till the stars came right again. And the secret priest would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule on the earth. This time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and reveal and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of the ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. In the elder time, chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams. But then something had happened. The great stone city, Raleigh, with its monoliths and sculptures, had sunk beneath the waves in the deep waters, full of the one primal mystery through which not even thought can pass, had cut off the spectral intercourse. But memory never died, and High Priest said that the city would arise again when the stars were right. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of the earth, moldy and shadowy, and full of dim rumors picked up in the caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. But of them old Castro dared not speak much. He cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. Of the coat, he said that he thought the center lay amid the pathless deserts of Arabia, where Iram, the city of pillars, dreams hidden and untouched. It was not, no book had never really hinted of it. It was not allied to the European witch coat, and was virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever really hinted of it, though the deathless Chinaman said that there were double meanings of Necronomicon, of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, which the initiated might read as they chose, especially the much discussed couplet. That is not death which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. Agassi, deeply impressed and not a little bewildered, had inquired in vain concerning this historic affiliations of the cult. Castro, apparently, had told the truth when he said that it was wholly secret. The authorities of Tulane University, New Orleans, could shed no light upon either cult or image, and now the detective had come to the highest authorities in the country and met with no more than the Greenland tale of the Professor Webb. The feverish interest aroused at the meeting by Lagassi's tale, corroborated as it was by the statuette, is echoed in the subsequent correspondence of those who attended. Although scant mention occurs in the formal publications of the society, caution is first care of those accustomed to face occasional charlatanry and imposture. Lagassi for some time lent the image to Professor Webb, but at the latter's death, it was returned to him and remains in his possession, where I viewed it not long ago. It is truly a terrible thing, and unmistakably akin to the dream sculpture of young Wilcox. That my uncle was excited by the tale of the sculpture, I did not wonder. For what thoughts must arise upon hearing, after a knowledge of what Lagassi had learned of the cult, of a sensitive young man who had dreamed not only that figure and exact hieroglyphics of the swamp-found image in the Greenland devil tablet, but had come in his dreams upon at least 3 of the precise words of the formula uttered alike by Eskimo, Diabolis, and mongrel Louisianans. Professor Angel's instant start on an investigation of the utmost thoroughness was eminently natural, though privately I suspected young Wilcox of having heard of the cult in some indirect way, and of having invented a series of dreams to heighten and continue the mystery at my uncle's expense. The dream narratives and cuttings collected by a professor were, of course, strong corroboration, but the rationalism of my mind and extravagance of the whole subject led me to adopt what I thought the most sensible conclusions. So, after thoroughly studying the manuscript again and correlating the theosophical and anthropological notes with the cult narrative of Legacy, I made a trip to the Providence to see the sculptor and give him the rebuke I thought proper for so boldly imposing upon a learned and aged man. Wilcox still lived alone in the Fleur de Lis building in Thomas Street, a hideous Victorian imitation of the 17th century Breton architecture which flaunts its stucco front amidst of the lovely colonial houses on the ancient hill and under their very shadow of the finest Georgian steeple in America. I found him at work in his rooms and at once conceded from the specimens scattered about that his genius indeed profound and authentic. He will, I believe, sometime be heard from as one of the great descendants, for he has crystallized in clay and will one day mirror in marble those nightmares and fantasies which Arthur Machen evokes in prose, and Clark Ashton Smith makes visible in verse and in painting. Dark, frail, and somewhat unkempt in aspect, he turned languidly at my knock and asked me my business without rising. When I told him who I was, he displayed some interest, for my uncle had excited his curiosity in probing his strange dreams. Yet had never explained the reason for my study. I did not enlarge his knowledge in regard, but sought with some subtlety to draw him out. In a short time, I became convinced of his absolute sincerity, for he spoke of the dreams in a manner none could mistake. They, in their subconsciousness resident, had influenced his art profoundly, and he shewed me a morbid statue whose contours almost made me shake with the potency of his black suggestion. He could not recall having seen the original of this thing except in his own dream, bas relief. But the outlines had formed themselves insensibly under his hands. It was, no doubt, the giant shape he had raved of in delirium. That he really knew nothing of the hidden cult, save from what my uncle's relentless catechism had let fall, he soon made clear, and again I strove to think of some way in which he could possibly have received the weird impressions. He walked of his dreams in a strangely poetic fashion, making me see with terrible vividness the damp cyclopean city of slimy green stone, whose geometry, he oddly said, was all wrong, and here, with frightened expectancy, the ceaselessness, half-mental calling from underground, Cthulhu Fatijin, Cthulhu Fatijin. These words had formed part of that dread ritual which told the dead Cthulhu's dream vigil in his stone vault at Raleigh, and I felt deeply moved despite my irrational beliefs. Wilcox, I was sure, had heard of the cult in some casual way, and had soon forgotten it amidst the mass of his equally weird readings and imagining. Later, by virtue of its sheer impressiveness, it had found subconscious expression in dreams, in the bas relief, and in the terrible statue I now beheld, so that his imposture upon my uncle had been a very innocent one. The youth was of a type at once slightly affected and slightly ill-mannered, which I could never like, but I was willing enough now to admit, both with genius and his honesty, I took leave of his amicably and wished him all the success his talent promised. The matter of the coast still remained to fascinate me, and at times I had visions of personal fame from researches into the origin and connections. I visited New Orleans, talked with LeGlace and others of that old time raiding party, so the frightful image, and even questioned such of the mongrel prisoners as still survived. Old Castro, unfortunately, had been dead for some years. What I now heard so graphically at first hand, though it was really no more than a detailed confirmation of what my uncle had written, excited me afresh, for I felt sure I was on the track of a very real, very secret, and very ancient religion whose discovery would make me an anthropologist of note. My attitude was still one of the absolute materialism, as I wish it still were, and I discounted with almost inexplicable perversity and coincidence of the dream notes of the odd cuttings collected by Professor Angel. One thing I began to suspect, and which I now fear I know, is that my uncle's death was far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading up from an ancient waterfront swarming with foreign mongrels after a careless push from a Negro settler. I did not forget the mixed-blooded and marine pursuits of his cult members in Louisiana. And would not be surprised to learn the secret methods and the poison needles as ruthless and as anciently known as cryptic rites and beliefs. LeGlace and his men, it is true, had been let alone, but in no way a certain seaman who saw things in dead. Might not the deeper inquiries of my uncle after encountering the sculpture's data have come to sinister ears? I think Professor Angel died because he knew too much, or because he was likely to learn too much. Whether I shall go as he did remains to be seen, for I have learned much now,